Welcome to the third of the week 8 videos where I'm going to give you your feedback on the source about the Vikings invading England. The first question was, what does the source tell us about the nature of Viking warfare? Well, we see it as highly maneuverable. They use the seas and the rivers to their advantage. They launched invasions using their long ships. But they're also adaptable. As well as using the water, they also use horses. There's one reference to where they capture a bunch of horses and are able to get on horseback and continue their raids that way. And the English really struggle to deal with this type of rapid warfare. A lot of emphasis is placed on destruction in the sources, destruction of towns and of monasteries. We can see this as a kind of a hit and run form of warfare. Go in hard against your enemy, move on if necessary, keep one step ahead of the enemy. And this was a very effective form of warfare, which the English struggled to deal with. This brings us to our second question, which was, what weaknesses on the English side do we learn about? We see there's poor leadership. In one extract, there's blame placed on Hugh, who's described as a, quote, Frankish peasant, which clearly is a foreigner and as a man of low birth makes him, in the eyes of the chronicler, unsuitable to lead. And also there's a man called Elfrich who claims to be ill in order not to fight the Vikings. So there's no clear English leadership there. The king is not mentioned. We see how it's left to local forces to deal with Viking cities, local lords, etc., local government officials. And the English struggle to deal with the rapidity of the Viking attacks. We see, for example, where they have insufficient forces or the Vikings assemble too quickly and the English are unable to get the reinforcements they hoped for. So, put simply, they're unable to deal with the nature of Viking warfare. The third question asked, how might the religious perspective of the monks influence their writing? Well, firstly, the monks are often on the receiving end of these Viking attacks, for example, in Exeter, which is mentioned in the extract. Monasteries were rich pickings. They had lots of valuable books, for example. I'm struggling to think of the right word for it, but the cups that they used for performing religious ceremonies were often made of silver. There were rich pickings, but also monasteries were poorly defended because monks did not fight. They were sworn to a religious way of life. So clearly being on the end of these attacks would make the monks pretty unhappy with the people attacking them. The Vikings, at least in the early centuries, were pagan, that is non-Christian, which again was a source of anger to the Christian monks who they attacked. They would have seen these attacks not as pillaging for profit, but as attacks by non-Christians on Christians. They would have seen themselves as singled out, even if that wasn't really the Vikings' motives. By this period, around about the year 1000, the Vikings in theory were Christian, although how many of the warriors themselves had followed their kings in adopting Christianity is hard to tell. Certainly the monks brought up in this tradition of writing would still have seen the Vikings as a pagan enemy, even if they were not technically pagan at that point. Finally, monks saw history in terms of God's will. When things go well for the Christians, it's because God is helping them. For example, where London survives an attack because the Virgin Mary supports the Londoners because the Vikings have attacked them on her feast day. When things do not go well for the Christians, it's because they are being punished for their sins. The Vikings, not so much in this source, but very often in Chronicles, are seen as God's punishment sent against the Christians because they are sinful. So either way, the monks see these events not as humans with human motivations, but as God's motivation and God's purposes for his flock